Now, a report by Stellenbosch University's Prof Sope Williams, titled Legal Framework on Sexual Corruption, has found that many female entrepreneurs are asked for sexual favours in exchange for government contracts. She joins us this evening to expand on this specific part of research. Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme. So you conducted this research on sexual corruption, or sextortion, if you will. What prompted this kind of research, and what exactly have you found?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the show. So initially, I was doing research on what we call gender-responsive procurement, which basically is looking at, women-owned businesses obtaining government contracts. And when I did this research, I interviewed a number of women entrepreneurs, not just in South Africa, but across 7 other African countries. And to my surprise, I found that a lot of women entrepreneurs don't access public contracts because they are asked not just for financial bribes, but they're also asked for sexual acts or sexual favors in exchange for getting these government contracts. So the finding was surprising because we normally expect that women who are entrepreneurs, who own businesses and can navigate the procurement system are usually well-to-do. They're middle class, they're suburban, they have certain level of privilege. And I wasn't really expecting to find sexual corruption as one of the things that made them abstain or unable to get public contracts.
And then beyond this, if we had to be more granular, what else was unearthed in just your discovery or your research?
Right. So I think what was really unearthed was the fact that women are asked for sexual intercourse. So they face what we would call a double bribery conundrum. Women are asked for bribes in terms of money, the same way that male entrepreneurs are, but they're also asked for sexual intercourse or sexual acts. And we also found that women cannot complain about these because of the fear of retaliation, the fear of reprisal, the fear of being locked out of the procurement system. And of course, the fact that under our corruption laws, both the giver and the receiver of a bribe are culpable under the law. So this really prevented women from speaking out about it, apart from obviously the shame and the stigma that you normally have with sexual offenses and sexual violence.
Now that you touch on the law, I want us to touch on the shortcomings of a legal framework to address sexual corruption, because it was there in your executive summary where you pointed out that there are gaps in the legal framework. Yes,
indeed. So I think the biggest gap is the fact that if you look at sexual corruption as a corruption offense, which it is, it differs from sexual harassment because there's this element of an exchange, right? So it's a public official saying, well, if you want access to this service or you want access to this benefit, you must do this for me. So the legal system is inadequate because under our Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, as I've said, both the giver and the receiver of the bribe are culpable.
Yes.
And so women cannot complain or report because it means that they are also criminalized under the law, right? So that's problematic. The other thing is that sexual corruption might be criminalized, not criminalized, but might be penalized under sexual harassment laws, but that's usually under employment or labor law, and that's not a criminal penalty that the perpetrator will receive. So there are areas where you can be covered under a legal framework, but it doesn't cover all categories of women. It covers some women under sexual harassment policies. It covers learners under the Employment of Educators Act. It covers people under the age of 16 under our Sexual Offences Act, but it does not cover women who are subject to sexual corruption in all in all dimensions or in all aspects of public life.
Now, Professor, you made recommendations, some around sustained advocacy and victim-centered reporting mechanisms. Just talk us through those.
Right. So I think what's really important is, first, is decriminalization of victims of sexual corruption. Because without that decriminalization, then women who are victims will not be able to come out, right? They won't be able to report. And then if we do get that decriminalization, we then need to create victim-centered reporting. So avenues where women who are victims can complain, can make reports about this. So I'll give an example. In Tanzania has an offense of sexual bribery, which does not criminalize the victims. And what they've also done in their public sector is that they've created what they call gender desks in most of their organs of states or, or public departments, where women can access those gender desks and say, look, this is what happened to me while I was navigating procurement, or even accessing any other public service or any other public benefits in this organization. And then that organization, that gender desk, can take that forward. So victim-centered reporting is making a safe space for women to make these complaints, where the complaints will be heard, will be believed, where the evidence can be obtained, and where something can be done about it. Is really what I mean about that. In terms of the sustained advocacy, I think what's important is really having conversations as to why we have this kind of problem. I've said, I think in an earlier context, that sexual corruption is the marriage of sexual violence and corruption. And in South Africa, we have problems with sexual violence, we have problems with gender-based violence, and we have problems with corruption. And you bring the two together, you get sexual corruption. And so we're trying to really raise awareness of this problem and let people understand the impact that this has done. And on the basis of that, there's an organization called the African Women Against Corruption Network, which is led by a woman called Zakona Mbelase. And they recently released a documentary called Rising Voices, Unmasking Sexual Corruption in South Africa. That documentary is available on YouTube if you search for it. And that documentary really you get to hear the experiences of victims of sexual corruption, young women who have been asked for sexual favors in order to get jobs, in order to get a bursary, in order to keep their employment, and so on and so forth. So I think the advocacy we're doing is to really let people understand what this is, the impact it has, and to get men on board, fighting alongside women, because they are the real allies. They are the ones who can call out other men and speak to them and say, what is happening is not good.
And I suppose legislatures as well, that in as much as you're going to get men on board, you need law enforcement, you need lawmakers as well, parliamentarians. You need their buy-in because, as you say, there is a gap in the legislative framework that can properly or adequately address this issue. So are you having that sit down? Because this is honestly a very important report and warrants a broader conversation, but with all stakeholders at the table.
Yes. So we're having those conversations with different groups of stakeholders. As you know, advocacy is a long play. And even though this matter is urgent and it's important and it really undermines gender equality, undermines the ability of women to succeed in business, we're sitting down with different groups of stakeholders and saying, look, this is what needs to be done. This is the problem. This undermines trust in government. And when you lose trust in government, you know what happens. You get backlash from citizens, you get more uprising, you get more agitation. So we are having those conversations, and with programs like yours that are, heard, nationally and through the region, we're hoping that more and more people will get to listen and understand, and policymakers and politicians and those in positions of power will do something. No, it does take us a step forward, because these were allegations that were always brought to the fore. But when you have credible institutions conducting research on this, then there's something even more substantial to talk about, to say, here it is, here is the research, individuals were interviewed, and this is a serious problem in the country that must be addressed. So hopefully those lawmakers will then try and expedite that kind of situation where they address the lacuna in law so that we have the right tools to prosecute. But thank you very much for joining us, Professor, this evening. That is Professor Sope Williams speaking to us.